The year 1955 in film involved some significant events. November 3, The Musical Guys and Dolls, starring Marlon Brando and Frank Sinatra, debuts. June 27, the last ever Republic serial, King of the Carnival, is released. September 30, American actor James Dean dies in a car crash near Colim, California. Top grossing films, awards, Academy Awards, Best Picture, Marty, Hecht Lancaster, United Artists, Best Director, Delbert Mann, Marty, Best Actor, Ernest Bourne, Marty, Best Actress, Anna Magnani, The Rose Tattoo, Best Supporting Actor, Jack Lemmon, Mr. Roberts, Best Supporting Actress, Jo Van Fleet, East of Eden, Golden Globe Awards, Drama, Best Picture, East of Eden, Best Actor, Ernest Bourne Marty, Best Actress, Anna Magnani The Rose Tattoo, Musical or Comedy, Best Picture, Guys and Dolls, Best Actor, Tommy Weller The 7-Year Itch, Best Actress, Gene Simmons Guys and Dolls, Other, Best Director, Joshua Logan Picnic, Best Foreign Film, Audette, Denmark, Best Foreign Film, Stella, Greece, Best Foreign Film, Sons, Mothers, and a General, West Germany, Best Foreign Film, Eyes of Children, Japan, Palm Dog, Marty, directed by Delbert Mann, United States, Golden Lion, Audette, directed by Carl Theodor Dreyer, Denmark, Golden Bear, Die Ratten, directed by Robert Siodmak, West Germany, Top 10 Money-Making Stars, Notable Films released in 1955, USA unless stated, 5 Against the House, starring Kim Novak, Guy Madison, Brian Keith Abbott and Costello Meet the Keystone Cops, starring Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, featuring an appearance by Mack Sennett. Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, starring Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, Above Us the Waves, starring John Mills, The Adventures of Quentin Durward, starring Robert Taylor, Kay Kendall, Ain't Misbehavin', starring Piper Laurie, Rory Calhoun, Mamie Van Doren, All That Heaven Allows, directed by Douglas Sirk, starring Jane Wyman and Rock Hudson, The Americano, starring Glenn Ford, Lamech, directed by Michelangelo Antonioni, and Alnahora Ch. Apache Ambush, starring Richard Jaeckel, Artists and Models, starring Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis, Dorothy Malone, Shirley MacLaine, Azad, starring Dilip Kumar, B. Bad Day at Black Rock, directed by John Sturges, starring Spencer Tracy, Robert Ryan, Anne Francis, Dean Jagger, Walter Brennan, Ernest Bourne, Lee Marvin, Battle Cry, starring Van Heflin, Aldo Ray, Anne Francis, Bedeviled, starring Anne Baxter and Steve Forrest, The Big Combo, starring Cornel Wilde, Richard Conte, Brian Donlevy, Gene Wallace, The Big Knife, starring Jack Palance, Ida Lupino, Gene Hagen, Rod Steiger, Shelley Winters, Blackboard Jungle, starring Glenn Ford, Anne Francis, Louis Calhern, Sidney Poitier, Vic Morrow, Richard Kiley, Blood Alley, starring John Wayne and Lauren Bacall. A Bullet for Joey, starring Edward G. Robinson and George Raft, C. Captain Lightfoot, starring Rock Hudson, Carrington V.C., starring David Niven, Cast a Dark Shadow, starring Dirk Bogarde, Chief Crazy Horse, starring Victor Mature, Cinerama Holiday, Sisk de Rat, The Cobweb, directed by Vincent Minnelli, starring Richard Widmark, Gloria Graham, Lauren Bacall, Charles Boyer, Lillian Gish, The Cockle Shell Heroes, directed by and starring Joseph Copyright Ferrer, with Trevor Howard, The Cold It Story, directed by Guy Hamilton, starring John Mills and Eric Portman, Confession, directed by Ken Hughes, starring Sidney Chaplin, Mr. Arkadin, starring Orson Welles and Michael Redgrave, The Constant Husband, starring Rex Harrison, Margaret Leighton, Kay Kendall, Count 3 and Prey, starring Van Heflin, Joanne Woodward and Raymond Burr, The Counterfeit Coin, The Court Martial of Billy Mitchell, directed by Otto Preminger, starring Gary Cooper, Charles Bickford, Ralph Bellamy, Rod Steiger, Elizabeth Montgomery, Peter Graves, Crash Out, starring Arthur Kennedy and William Bendix, The Criminal Life of Archibaldo de la Cruz, directed by Louis Bois plus or minus well, D. Daddy Long Legs, starring Fred Astaire and Leslie Caron, The Dam Busters, starring Richard Todd and Michael Redgrave, with an early role by Robert Shaw, Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, starring Fess Parker and Buddy Ebsen, Death of a Cyclist, directed by Juan Antonio Bardem, The Deep Blue Sea, starring Vivian Leigh, The Desperate Hours, starring Humphrey Bogart and Frederick March, Devdas, based on novel with same name, starring Dilip Kumar, Vijay and Thimala, Suchitra Sen, Les Diaboliques, directed by Henri Georges Clouzot, starring Simone Signoret, Dreams, directed by Ingmar Bergman, starring Eva Dalbeck, E.F., East of Eden, directed by Elia Kazan, starring Julie Harris, James Dean, Raymond Massey, The Enchanted Boy, Escuela de Vagabundos, starring Pedro Infante, The Far Country, directed by Anthony Mann, starring James Stewart, Ruth Roman, Walter Brennan, The Far Horizons, starring Fred McMurray, Charlton Heston, Donna Reed, Barbara Hale, The Fast and the Furious, starring John Ireland and Dorothy Malone, Female on the Beach, starring Joan Crawford, Jeff Chandler, Jan Sterling, Fire in the Night, Floating Clouds, Footsteps in the Fog, starring Stuart Granger and Gene Simmons, Foxfire, starring Jane Russell, Francis in the Navy, starring Donald O'Connor and Martha Hyer, with Clint Eastwood in an early role, G.H., Galapagos, a documentary by Thor Heyerdahl, A Generation, directed by Anzej Warder, The Girl Rush, starring Rosalind Russell, Fernando Lamas, Gloria de Haven, Godzilla Raids Again, Good Morning, Miss Dove, starring Jennifer Jones and Robert Stack, Guys and Dolls. Directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz, starring Marlon Brando, Gene Simmons, Frank Sinatra, Vivian Blaine, Hell on Frisco Bay, starring Alan Ladd and Edward G. Robinson, Hell's Island, starring John Payne and Mary Murphy, Heroes of Shipka, The Hidden One, starring Pedro Armendariz, Hit the Deck, directed by Roy Rowland, starring Jane Powell, Debbie Reynolds, Ann Miller, Tony Martin, Vic Damone, House of Bamboo, starring Robert Ryan, How to Be Very, Very Popular, starring Betty Grable in her final film role, I Am a Camera, starring Julie Harris and Lawrence Harvey, I Died 1,000 Times, starring Jack Palance, Shelley Winters, Earl Holliman, Lee Marvin I Live in Fear, directed by Akira Kurosawa, I'll Cry Tomorrow, starring Susan Hayward, Illegal, a film noir starring Edward G. Robinson and Jane Mansfield, Interrupted Melody, starring Eleanor Parker and Glenn Ford, It Came From Beneath the Sea, starring Kenneth Tobey and Faith Domergue, with special effects by Ray Harryhausen, It Happened on July 20, directed by G. W. Pabst, starring Bernhard Wicki, It's Always Fair Weather, starring Gene Kelly, Dan Daly, Michael Kidd, Sid Caris, Jeddah, directed by Charles Chauvel, John and Julie, starring Moira Lister and Sid James, Journey to the Beginning of Time, Jupiter's Darling, directed by George Sidney, starring Esther Williams and Howard Keel, K.L., Kania Zulcum, starring N.T. Rama Rao, The Kentuckian, directed by and starring Burt Lancaster, featuring film debut of Walter Matthau, Killer's Kiss, directed by Stanley Kubrick, Kiss Me Deadly, directed by Robert Aldrich, starring Ralph Meeker as Mickey Spillane, Mike Hammer, Lady and the Tramp, an animated Disney musical featuring voice of Peggy Lee, The Ladder Killers, directed by Alexander McKendrick, starring Alec Guinness, Cecil Parker, Herbert Lom, Peter Sellers, Land of the Pharaohs, starring Joan Collins and Jack Hawkins, The Last Frontier. Directed by Anthony Mann, starring Victor Mature, Robert Preston, Anne Bancroft, The Last 10 Days, directed by G. W. Pabst, The Left Hand of God, starring Humphrey Bogart and Gene Tierney, Little Red Monkey, directed by Ken Hughes, Lola Montez, directed by Max Affair 1/4 LS, The Long Grey Line, starring Tyrone Power and Maureen O'Hara, Love is a Many Splendid Thing, starring William Holden and Jennifer Jones, Love Me or Leave Me, starring Doris Day and James Canney, Love Never Dies, Lucy Gallant, starring Jane Wyman, M. Magic Fire, starring Alan Badal, Mumbo, directed by Robert Rossen. Starring Silvana Mangano, Vittorio Gassman, Shelley Winters, A Man Alone, directed by and starring Ray Milland, with Mary Murphy and Raymond Burr, The Man from Laramie, directed by Anthony Mann, starring James Stewart, The Man Who Loved Redheads, starring Moira Shearer, The Man with the Golden Arm, directed by Otto Preminger, starring Frank Sinatra, Eleanor Parker, Darren McGavin, Kim Novak, Arnold Stang, Man with a Gun, starring Robert Mitchum, Man Without a Star, starring Kirk Douglas and William Campbell, Marty, directed by Delbert Mann, starring Ernest Bourne, Betsy Blair, Joe Mantle, Frank Sutton, Jerry Paris, The McConnell Story, starring Alan Ladd and June Allison, The Mill of Good Luck, Miracle of Marcelino, My Summer, starring N.T. Rama Rao, Mr. Roberts, co-directed by John Ford and Mervyn Leroy, starring Henry Fonda, James Caney, William Powell and Jack Lemmon, Moonfleet, starring Stuart Granger and Joan Greenwood, Mr. and Mrs. 55, starring Guru Dutt and Madhubala, Mr. Arkadin, directed by and starring Orson Welles, My Sister Eileen, starring Janet Leigh and Betty Garrett, N.O., New York Confidential, starring Broderick Crawford, Richard Conte, Marilyn Maxwell, Anne Bancroft, Night and Fog, a documentary directed by Alain Resnais, The Night My Number Came. Up, starring Michael Redgrave, The Night of the Hunter, directed by Charles Laughton, starring Robert Mitchum, Shelley Winters, Lillian Gish, Peter Graves, Not as a Stranger, starring Robert Mitchum, Olivia de Havilland, Frank Sinatra, Gloria Graham, Broderick Crawford, Lon Chaney, Jr. Oklahoma. Starring Gordon McCrae, Shirley Jones, Rod Steiger, Gloria Graham, Eddie Albert, Gene Nelson, Audette, directed by Carl Theodor Dreyer, Othello, starring Sergei Bondarchuk, Our Best Days, starring Omar Sharif, PQ, Partha Panchali, directed by Satyajit Ray, Pete Kelly's Blues, starring Jack Webb, Janet Leigh, Edmund O'Brien and Peggy Lee, also featuring Jane Mansfield as a cigarette girl, A Phoenix City Story, starring Richard Kiley, John McIntyre, John Larch, James Edwards, Edward Andrews, Picnic, directed by Joshua Logan, starring William Holden, Kim Novak, Cliff Robertson, Rosalind Russell, Prince of Players, starring Richard Burton, Princess Yang Kwai-Fui, The Prisoner, directed by Peter Glenville, starring Alec Guinness and Jack Hawkins, The Private War of Major Benson, starring Charlton Heston, The Prodigal, starring Lana Turner, The Quatermass Experiment, Queen Bee, starring Joan Crawford, The Racers, starring Kirk Douglas, Gilbert Roland, Bella Davie, Radio Stories, Die Ratten, starring Maria Schull and Kurtjar won quarter a GNS Golden Bear Award, Rage at Dawn, starring Randolph Scott, The Reigns of Rankipa, starring Lana Turner and Richard Burton, Rebel Without a Cause, directed by Nicholas Ray, starring James Dean, Sal Mineo, Natalie Wood, featuring Jim Backus, Dennis Hopper and Edward Platt, Red Fish, starring Arturo Dakar Cubed RDOVA, Richard III, directed by and starring Laurence Olivier, with Ralph Richardson, Claire Bloom, John Gielgud, Rififi, directed by Jules Dassin, A Ripple in the Pond, Romeo and Juliet, starring Yuri Zdanov and Galina Ulanova, Roots, The Rose Tattoo, starring Anna Magnani and Burt Lancaster, Run for Cover, starring James Caney, John Derrick, Ernest Bourne S. Samurai 2, Duel at Ishijiji Temple, Scandal in Sorrento, starring Vittorio De Sica and Sophia Loren, The Scarlet Coat, starring Cornel Wilde, George Sanders, Anne Francis, The Sea Chase, starring John Wayne and Lana Turner, Seagulls Die in the Harbor, Seamar. Starring Newton, The Seven Little Foys, starring Bob Hope, featuring James Caney reprising role of George M. Cohen from Yankee Doodle Dandy, The 7-Year Itch, directed by Billy Wilder, starring Marilyn Monroe and Tommy Well, Shri 420, directed by and starring Raj Kapoor, with Nargis, The Shrike, directed by and starring Joseph Copyright Ferrer, The Sign of Venus, starring Sophia Loren and Vittorio De Sica, Simba, starring Dirk Bogarde, Sissy, starring Romy Schneider, Six Bridges to Cross, starring Tony Curtis, Smiles of a Summer Night, directed by Ingmar Bergman, So This Is Paris, starring Tony Curtis and Gloria de Haven, The Spoilers, starring Anne Baxter and Jeff Chandler, Strategic Air Command, starring James Stewart, Stella, directed by Michael Soyanis, starring Melina Mercury, Summertime, directed by David Lean, starring Katharine Hepburn, Rossano Brazzi and Darren McGavin, The Swindlers, directed by Federico Fellini, starring Broderick Crawford, TV, Tyra Clan Saga, directed by Kenji Mizoguchi, Tall Man Riding, starring Randolph Scott and Dorothy Malone, The Tall Men, starring Clark Gable, Jane Russell, Robert Ryan, Tarantula, directed by Jack Arnold, starring John Agar, Mara Corday, Leo G. Carroll, with Clint Eastwood in a bit part, The Tender Trap, starring Frank Sinatra. Debbie Reynolds, David Wayne, Celeste Holm, That Lady, starring Olivia de Havilland, This Island Earth, directed by Joseph M. Newman, starring Jeff Morrow, Rex Reason, Faith Domergue, Russell Johnson, Three for the Show, starring Betty Grable, Tight Spot, starring Ginger Rogers, Edward G. Robinson, Brian Keith, Lorne Greene, To Catch a Thief, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Cary Grant and Grace Kelly, To Hell and Back, starring Audie Murphy, Marshall Thompson, Charles Drake, David Janssen, The Treasure of Pancho Villa, starring Rory Calhoun and Shelley Winters, Trial, starring Glenn Ford, The Trouble with Harry, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Edmund Gwynne, John Forsythe, Shirley MacLaine, Unknown Soldier, Unchained, starring Barbara Hale, Underwater, starring Jane Russell, Untamed, starring Tyrone Power and Susan Hayward, The Violent Men, starring Glenn Ford, Barbara Stanwyck, Edward G. Robinson, Brian Keith, Violent Saturday, starring Victor Mature, Ernest Bourne, Lee Marvin, The Virgin Queen, starring Bette Davis, Richard Todd, Joan Collins, WZ, We're No Angels, starring Humphrey Bogart, Peter Ustinov, Aldo Ray, Basil Rathbone, White Feather, starring Robert Wagner, Jeffrey Hunter, Deborah Paget, Wichita, starring Joel McCrea, The Woman in the Painting, Women's Prison, starring Ida Lupino, Jan Sterling, Audrey Totter, Phyllis Thaxter, You're Never Too Young, starring Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, with Raymond Burr, Serials, The Adventures of Captain Africa, King of the Carnival, Panther Girl of the Congo, short film series, Looney Tunes, Terrytoons, Merry Melodies, Popeye, Donald Duck, The Three Stooges, Tom and Jerry, Bugs Bunny, Mighty Mouse, Chip and Dale, Droopy, Yosemite Sam, Ranger Don, Speedy Gonzales, Cartoon, Good Will to Men, The Legend of Rockabye Point, No Hunting, Speedy Gonzales, One Reel, Gadgets Galore, Survival City 3rd Avenue. Three Kisses, Two Reel, The Battle of Gettysburg, The Face of Lincoln, On the 12th Day Euro, United Kingdom Series, Switzerland, 24-Hour Alert, Births, January 6, Rowan Atkinson, English comedian and actor, January 9, J.K. Simmons, American actor, January 18, Kevin Costner, American actor, producer and director, February 7, Miguel Ferrer, American actor, February 15, Christopher McDonald, American actor, February 19, Jeff Daniels, American actor, March 9, Ornella Muti, Italian actress, March 17, Gary Sinise, American actor, producer and director, March 19, Bruce Willis, American actor, March 22, Lena Olin, Swedish actress, April 23. Judy Davis, Australian actress, May 16, Deborah Winger, American actress, May 17, Bill Paxton, American actor, May 18, Chow Yun-fat, Hong Kong actor, May 31, Susie Essman, American actress, June 2, Dana Carvey, American actor and comedian, June 8, Griffin Dunne, American actor and director, June 9, Jimmy Smits, American actor, June 27, Isabella Gianni, French actress, July 21, Bar Copyright Lotta, Hungarian director, July 22, Willem Dafoe, American actor, August 4, Billy Bob Thornton, American actor, director and screenwriter, August 19, Peter Gallagher, American actor, August 27, Diana Scoid, American actress. November 13, Whoopi Goldberg, American actress and comedienne, December 3, Melody Anderson, Canadian actress, December 18, Ray Liotta, American actor, deaths, February 12, Tom Moore, 71, Irish-American actor, Forever Amber, Roadhouse, February 12, Eszed Sakal, 72, Hungarian actor, Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy, April 7, Theda Bara, 69, American actress, A Fool There Was, Cleopatra, June 11, Walter Hampton, 75, American actor, Sabrina, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, July 31, Robert Francis, 25, American actor, The Caine Mutiny, The Long Grey Line, August 5, Carmen Miranda, 46, Brazilian singer, actress, Copacabana. The Gang's All Here, September 30, James Dean, 24, American actor, Rebel Without a Cause, East of Eden, October 1, Charles Christie, 75, Canadian pioneer film studio owner, October 19, John Hodiak, 41, American actor, Lifeboat, A Bell for Adeno, November 15, Lloyd Bacon, 65, American director, The Oklahoma Kid, Newt Rockne, All-American, November 22, Shemp Howard, 60, American actor, comedian of The Three Stooges, Brideless Groom, Malice in the Palace, film debuts, James Cromwell, Daddy Long Legs, Clint Eastwood, Revenge of the Creature, Dennis Hopper, Rebel Without a Cause, Shirley MacLaine, The Trouble with Harry, Jane Mansfield, Female Jungle, Walter Matthau, The Kentuckian, Melina Mercury, Stella, Elizabeth Montgomery, The Court Martial of Billy Mitchell. References